Hi everyone. So we come to the next topic of financial management, and if you remember, I told you there are three decisions. When we talk about financial management, there are three financial decisions which we have to take. We talked about investment decision and the factors affecting investment decision. Now we are going to talk about financing decision and the factors affecting financing decision. Now, what is financing decision and why do we need to study this particular decision? Now, the decision about quantum of finance to be raised from various long-term sources. When we talk about source, if you remember, we have already done this in plus one. When you were in plus one, you have already done about sources of finance. And when I started with the video of this chapter, I gave an introduction where I talked about sources on the basis of tenure, that is long term, medium term, short term, on the basis of ownership, that is owner's fund or shareholders fund or borrowed fund. And third, I talked about internal source and external source on the basis of generation. Now, when we talk about financing decision, we are talking about shareholders or owners fund and borrowed fund. So, it is on the basis of ownership, the sources of fund is going to be discussed out here. When we talk about financing decision, the basic thing which we talk about is that how much should be our own fund and how much should be our borrowed fund. People give different proportions. Some people say, if you talk about own is to borrowed, some people say own 70, borrowed 30. Some people say own 60, borrowed 40. Some people say own 30, borrowed 70, or maybe this 40 and this 60. People have different notions about it. Now, if you really think about it, if you have your own money 70 and you borrow 30, if you have money, you can manage it, there is no harm. But I always believe that we should keep some money as buffer and borrow from the market. The other day I told you that borrowed fund is comparatively a cheaper source of finance, which we are going to discuss again out here. So it always will give you benefit if you keep some of your own money as buffer, so that whenever it is required you may use it. So 70-30 proportion I usually don't prefer. 60-40 is okay. Now, if you talk about 30 and 70 as a ratio, our own money 30 and borrowed 70, difficult situation. Why? It's a simple situation like this. Out of 3 rupees, how will I pay off 7 rupees? Same case goes here. Out of 4 rupees, how will I pay off 6 rupees? So I always prefer, my personal preference is like it should be 50-50. If you have this kind of proportion of fund, keep your 10 rupees as buffer and use 50-50 proportion, and whenever required use your buffer so that you can always cover up your cost. Personal opinion. One can take it the way they like. Right. Now, when we talk about financing decision, the decision about quantum of finance to be raised from various long-term sources. Here we have sources include shareholders and borrowed fund. Shareholder fund means we are talking about equity capital as well as retained earnings. If you remember, we talked about retained earnings in our plus one sources of business finance chapter. Retained earning is the earning which a business gets and keeps it aside for the purpose of reinvestment. So you retain it for the purpose of reinvestment. Only problem with retained earning is the enterprise which has just begun or just started does not have enough of retained earning until unless they actually reach the break-even point and they start earning the profits. So this is the basically this financing decision we are studying about a company which is already flourished and it is planning to raise fund from outside. Borrowed fund means debenture or other forms of debt, any kind form of debt, any form of debt which is short term or maybe it is long term when you talk in terms of it, or you want to take a loan from the bank, any kind of debt, or you're going to a private unorganized sector to borrow money from, whatever. A firm has to decide the proportion of funds to be raised from either sources based on their characteristics. Yes. Now, when I talk about characteristics, what exactly we are talking about? We are talking about merits as well as demerits of own and borrowed fund. When we talk about own fund or shareholders fund, best is higher returns, that we know. So it's a merit. It is not to be paid back, our own money. No interest involved, not at all, not risky. And you have the right of ownership. This is, I forgot this point. You have right of ownership, you become the owner of the business. undoubtedly. Merit of borrowed fund, fixed, whatever. So if you are not very eager to take risk, borrowed is a good source of finance. No voting rights. It's kind of a merit. Why? Because this avoids delusion of control. I'll explain what is delusion of control. Right. So since this avoids delusion of control, it's a merit for total comparative proportion of sources, and it's comparatively less costly. We've already done this point. Why is it less costly? Because the rate of interest is fixed and this interest is a tax deductible expense. Where I talked about 10 own and 10 borrowed, and in for own we did not pay any interest, but for borrowed we pay 1 rupee interest at the rate of 10%, and then 30% was tax. So I explained to you that rupees 10, when we put our own money, 10 costs us 7, and when we put our borrowed money, 10 costs us 6 rupees 30 paisa. That is why borrowed fund is a cheaper source of finance. Alright. Next we go to the demerits of own fund. Now we know merits, we always say हमारा अपना पैसा है, हमारे को फ़ायदा होगा, ओन फंड्स के बड़े फ़ायदे होते हैं, पर उसके नुकसान भी हैं. सबसे पहली चीज़ क्या है? इट्स अ कॉस्टली सोर्स ऑफ फाइनेंस. वी हैव ऑलरेडी डिस्कस्ड इट. आई जस्ट नॉट टोल्ड यू दैट कंपैरेटिव एनालिसिस. Additional equity leads to dilution of power of existing shareholders. Exactly. Like for example, if you already have, suppose there are 10 people who have pulled in 10 rupees each and they are the equity shareholders. Now company needs urgent money. It wants to borrow from outside. Nobody is ready to lend money to the company. So one of the people, they say that okay fine, we'll give you money, but as much money we give, our voting rights should increase according to that. Of course equity shareholders के voting right to increase होंगे. Sometimes what happens is people from outside, they agree to invest in a company provided they invest more money than what is already existing shareholders are having. So they have more power, they become the owners of the company and they dilute our control. हमारे कंट्रोल पे हमारे इक्विटी शेयर्स पे पानी फिर जाता है. इसको कहा जाता है वाटरिंग द इक्विटी या डिल्यूशन ऑफ कंट्रोल. मतलब क्या? जब बाहर के इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स ज़्यादा हो जाते हैं और एग्जिस्टिंग शेयर होल्डर्स, इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स कंपैरेटिवली कम हो जाते हैं, तो डिल्यूशन ऑफ कंट्रोल हो जाता है. ओके फाइन. डिल्यूशन ऑफ पावर. समटाइम्स प्रोसीजर डिलेज आर इन्वॉल्व. ये तो हमें पता ही है कि अपना फंड रेज करने में प्रोसीजर डिलेज होते हैं. डीमेरिट ऑफ बोरोड फंड्स, परमानेंट बर्डन ऑन द कंपनी. फिक्स रेट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट है. हमेशा याद रखिए, जब भी कोई कंपनी है उसने अगर कोई प्रॉफिट कमाया है तो सबसे पहले किसको पे करना है? डिवेंचर होल्डर्स को, फिर क्रेडिटर्स को, फिर किसको? प्रेफरेंस शेयर होल्डर्स को. लास्ट में बचा कुचा किसको मिलता है? इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर को. और बचा कुचा भी तब मिलता है जब आप री इन्वेस्ट करने के लिए या बाकी खर्चे निकालने के बाद आप पैसा रख देते हैं. तो जब सारा कुछ जो है इतना ज़्यादा पैसा जो है वो इतने खर्चे हो रहे हैं, और उसके अलावा जब आप बात कर रहे हैं कि जो परमानेंट बर्डन है कंपनी के लिए कि ये बेयर करना ही पड़ेगा, आप इंटरेस्ट को छोड़ नहीं सकते. जो मर्जी आए हो जाए आपको इंटरेस्ट पे बैक करना ही पड़ता है. इट हैज़ टू बी पेड बैक. और आपको यहाँ पर यू हैव टू पे इट बैक, हैव टू बी पेड बैक इन टर्म्स ऑफ प्रिंसिपल अमाउंट. आपको प्रिंसिपल अमाउंट पे करना पड़ता है. ओके, एज वेल एज आपको इंटरेस्ट भी पे करना पड़ता है. तो ये तो पेड बैक होता ही होता है, वापस देना ही देना है. कंपनी कैन नॉट बोरो आफ्टर अ सर्टेन लिमिट. देखो भाई, आप किसी से रोज़ उधार मांगने जाते हो, एक दिन आएगा वो आपको देख के बोलेगा अरे फिर उधार मांगने आ गया, भागो. आफ्टर अ लिमिट नोबडी इज रेडी टू लेंड यू मनी. कोई आपको उधारी नहीं देगा. हमने बात करी मेरिट्स, डीमेरिट्स ऑफ ओन एंड बोरोड फंड. मेरिट्स, डीमेरिट्स, मेरिट्स ऑफ बोरोड फंड, डीमेरिट्स ऑफ बोरोड फंड. कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स. फर्म को डिसाइड करना पड़ता है प्रोपोर्शन ऑफ फंड टू बी रेज फ्रॉम आइदर सोर्सेज बेस्ड ऑन द कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स. ये कुछ एक ऐसे कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स हैं जिनको हमें ध्यान में रखना पड़ता है. इसके बेसिस पे कंक्लूजन क्या निकाला गया है कि सबसे पहले आपको क्या ध्यान रखना पड़ता है? आपको ध्यान रखना पड़ता है फाइनेंशियल रिस्क. आप बोरो तब करें जब आपके पास कैपेसिटी हो पैसा वापस करने की. अगर आपका डिफ़ॉल्ट ऑन एनी काइंड ऑफ पेमेंट है, जैसे कि इंटरेस्ट की पेमेंट या किसी भी तरह का डिफ़ॉल्ट ऑन पेमेंट होगा, तो आपका फाइनेंशियल रिस्क बढ़ जाएगा. सो फाइनेंशियल रिस्क इज टू बी कंसिडर्ड. रिस्क ऑफ डिफ़ॉल्ट ऑन पेमेंट ऑफ फिक्स इंटरेस्ट चार्जेस, ये कंसिडर करना ज़रूरी है. नेक्स्ट, कॉस्ट ऑफ ईच टाइप ऑफ सोर्स इज टू बी कंसिडर्ड. मैंने आपको बहुत बार ही बता दिया, कॉस्ट में डेट इज़ अ चीपर सोर्स ऑफ फाइनेंस इन कंपैरिजन टू इक्विटी. इक्विटी जो है कंपैरेटिवली एक्सपेंसिव पड़ती है. 10 लोग हैं, 10 शेयर होल्डर्स हैं, 10 शेयर होल्डर्स ने 1-1 रुपये दिया, आपके पास 10 रुपये आए. आपने बिजनेस में लगाया, वापस आपके पास 10 रुपये आए, जब आप बांटेंगे तो सबको क्या आएगा, बराबर बांटना पड़ेगा 1-1 रुपये के हिसाब से, तो वो बराबर चला जाता है। लेकिन वही 10 रुपये अगर आधे लोगों को, आप 5 लोगों को आप फिक्स कर दें कि हाँ जी हमने आपको सिर्फ 50 पैसा देना है, चाहे जो मर्जी आया हो जाए, क्योंकि वो फिक्स रेट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट वाले हैं, डिबेंचर होल्डर्स हैं, तो जो भी बचेगा वो इक्विटी शेयर होल्डर्स के लिए हमेशा ज़्यादा होता है। कुछ इस तरह से हम देख लें कि मान लीजिए यहाँ पर करते हैं, मान लीजिए ये 10 रुपये ही हैं आपके पास, 10 लोग हैं और 10 रुपये आपके पास रिटर्न आते हैं, तो 5 लोगों को आपने फिक्स कर दिया कि आप 2.5 रुपये हाफ ईच देंगे, हाफ ईच देंगे, तो यहाँ पर आ जाता है 2.5 रुपये। और अगर इनके लिए लेफ़्ट ओवर बढ़ेगा, ठीक है, ये 10 रुपये आपको रिटर्न आए, लगाए भी आपने 10 रुपये थे और रिटर्न भी आपको 10 रुपये आए, तो लेफ़्ट ओवर कितना हो जाएगा, 2.5 के बाद लेफ़्ट ओवर 7.5 हो जाएगा। हर बंदे को कितना मिलेगा, 1.5 रुपये मिलेगा। 5 लोगों को 1.5 रुपये मिल रहा है, तो कंपैरेटिवली ज़्यादा हो गया ना। तो बोला जाता है कि कॉस्ट ऑफ ईच टाइप ऑफ सोर्स इज़ टू बी कंसिडर्ड, एसोसिएटेड रिस्क इज़ टू बी कंसिडर्ड। एसोसिएटेड रिस्क क्या होता है, जैसे फिक्स्ड, ये जो आपने जब बात करी कि आपने कौन सा सोर्स ऑफ फाइनेंस लगाना है, तो उसके ऊपर कैसे कैसे खर्च हो रही है, उसके साथ के कैसे खर्चे हैं, हर चीज़ के अलग खर्चे हैं। इक्विटी का अपना खर्चा है, डिबेंचर्स का अपना खर्चा है। द रिस्क रिप्रेजेंट्स द पोटेंशियल फॉर लॉसेज ऑन इन्वेस्टमेंट एंड विल वेरी, किसके ऊपर वेरी करता है, डिपेंडिंग ऑन द एसेट और द सोर्स ऑफ फाइनेंस। ऑफ कोर्स इक्विटी का अलग खर्चा है, और जो भी एसोसिएटेड रिस्क है वो तो आपको कंसिडर करना ही पड़ेगा। तो फाइनेंसिंग डिसीजन इतना आसान नहीं होता, आपको फिनेंशियल रिस्क कंसिडर करना पड़ता है, आपको क्या कंसिडर करना पड़ता है, कॉस्ट कंसिडर करना पड़ता है। तो पहली चीज़ आपने ये कंसिडर करी, आपने उसके बाद क्या कंसिडर करा, कॉस्ट कंसिडर करा, फिर आपने क्या कंसिडर करा, आपने एसोसिएटेड रिस्क कंसिडर करा। ऑलराइट, so this decision determines the overall cost of capital and financial risk of an enterprise. Means what? When we talk about financing decision, we need to consider what all? First, the financial risk, second the cost, third the associated risk. Also, it says that overall cost of capital in terms of what? In terms of the interest to be paid or whatever. Like for example, when you raise fund from equity, flotation cost is involved. When you talk about debt, interest is involved. So there is financial risk in debt as a source of finance. The overall risk depends upon the proportion of debt. How much you borrow, that much would be your risk. There is a risk of flotation cost for funds raising. Yes. So for debt, if it is interest, for equity, it will be fundraising. Whichever way it is, you have to decide the right proportion. So financing decision is concerned with decision about how much to be raised from which source. That is, how much to be raised from the borrowed funds and how much to be raised from the equity, what proportion should be there, what quantum should be there. This is the introduction to financing decision. When you talk about the complete definition, now this you can get as a board question 1, and then this you can get as a board question 2, and this you can get as a board question 3. These are the 3 things which you get as a board question. This is just for your understanding that what are the merits, demerits, and how these affect the choice of decision of the proportion of debt and equity. Next we come to is factors affecting financing decisions. Alright, next we talk about is factors affecting financing decision. What are the factors affecting financing decision? Why do we talk about? In the just previous topic, when we discussed about the characteristics, various characteristics which are to be involved with the financing decision, we talked about cost, we talked about financial risk, we talked about associated risk. All these things were taken into consideration, but how these actually affect our working in terms of taking the financing decision or deciding the proportion of funds is what we are going to consider with the factors affecting the choice of financing decision in terms of debt or equity. Let's consider cost as the first one. See, we prefer debt or equity, which is a cheaper source of fund. Debt is a cheaper source of fund. So we prefer debt out here instead of equity. Why? Because equity is not so cheap comparatively. Next point we come to is risk. Now, which is more risky, debt or equity? Of course, debt is risky. Why? Because there is financial risk. What is financial risk? Financial risk is when the risk of default of payment on fixed interest charges, like if you are unable to pay that, or there's a threat of insolvency. If you are unable to pay to your debtors, or if you are unable to pay to the debenture holders, they may call in for a threat for insolvency. They may ask you to just pay them whichever way it is. Now what happens is, there's another kind of risk which is called associated risk. What is the associated risk? That depends upon the choice of debt or equity, whichever you are choosing. According to that, there would be an associated risk. So if these two risks are considered, we do not prefer debt, we prefer equity, because they are not so, equity is not so much risky. There is no threat of insolvency, there is no financial risk, it is not to be paid back at all, whereas debt is to be paid back. So considering the fact debt is to be paid back is what is the associated risk of debt, which is not the associated risk of equity. That is why it is preferred. Next we come to is flotation cost. Flotation cost is cost of raising fund. Again, now which one are we going to prefer? Are we going to prefer debt or equity? See, flotation cost in terms of debt or equity, either of the things is there. Now wherever your flotation cost comes more, that will not be preferred. So whether your flotation cost comes more, it is more expensive with debt, don't take it, don't borrow, don't include debt in your financing decision. If it is more with equity, don't prefer equity in your financing decision. So flotation cost is cost of raising fund, and you have to know that higher flotation cost, less attractive will be the source. Next, cash flow position. Now again, when you talk about debt and equity, we talk about cash inflow and cash outflow. When we talk about cash inflow, if we have lots of cash inflow, we have the capacity to pay interest, we prefer debt. But if we do not have enough of cash inflow, then what do we do? See, basically, if we have less cash inflow, we do not prefer debt. We may prefer equity, may not, that's a different thing. But at that time, debt cannot be preferred, because we do not have enough of cash inflow. We don't have enough of money to pay the interest. And then for paying interest, we borrow more. So that is a stupid idea. We don't do it. Alright. Next comes state of capital market. Now when you talk about state of capital market, there are two situations in a capital market. Either the capital market, there would be a recession, or the capital market will be rising. The stock price will be rising. In case stocks are rising, people prefer to invest in equity. Why? Because they prefer higher rate of dividend, higher returns, and in form of dividend. But if it is a depressed economy and the state of capital market is not very good, it is depressed, there is a recession or something like that, in that case people do not prefer putting money into equity, because they know if the money would go, the complete money would be, it will be a total loss to the complete money, there would be no returns. So it is better to, or preferable to, put money into debt. Why? Because there would be a fixed rate of return in form of interest. So state of capital market, debt, depressed capital market, people do not invest in equity, therefore debt preferred. Whereas equity, rising stock market, equity is preferred. Why? People like to put money into a market where their money multiplies. Fixed operating cost, cost of doing business, debt or equity. Now fixed operating cost, already your kharcha is happening, building, rent, salaries, you add up another kharcha, that is debt. On debt you pay interest, so you add up another kharcha. What will happen? It is not a very good idea. So if your fixed operating cost is already high, do not prefer debt. But if it is less, we prefer debt. Equity is preferred according to, again, associated risk when compared. Here this is fixed operating cost. Next, last point comes control consideration. Now when we talk about control consideration, see, let's be very clear. Debenture holders have no right to vote, no right to control, they are not the owners of the company. But equity shareholders have the right to vote, right to control, they are the owners of the company. Now, where will the dilution of control happen? Dilution of control means where will the control be a problem? Where there are owners. Suppose in the company, the inside equity is insufficient and they want to get some money. They want to get some more equity shareholders. And people, the ones who come from outside, getting their equity, they get more equity than what is already with the existing shareholders. So what happens in such a situation? The existing shareholders have less equity and the outsiders have more equity. This leads to watering the equity of the existing shareholder and dilution of control. In such a case, the companies prefer debt. Why? Because there is no right to vote, no right to control, and they're scared that the people from outside may come and take over the company. So for that purpose, they prefer debt. Control consideration, debt, no right to vote, no debt. That means debenture holders have no right to vote, no right to control, therefore preferred by companies who are afraid of takeover bid by the other people from outsiders. Equity, issue of more equity leads to dilution of control. This is from outside. When outside equity is more than the inside equity, it leads to watering the equity. What exactly do we mean by watering the equity of existing shareholders? That means the existing shareholders have less share and the outsiders have more share. I hope the factors affecting financing decision is clear to you. Next we'll be doing factors affecting dividend decision and what is dividend decision and why is it important. After that all the three decisions will discuss why the decisions are known as the pillars of the financial management. Till then, bye bye.